The night was thick with smoke and the low hum of engines struggling through mud-choked roads. Somewhere in the distance, a shell exploded, sending a shower of sparks and debris into the black sky. Supply lines, the lifeblood of the Allied forces, were bleeding. Trucks laden with ammunition, food, and medical supplies vanished almost as quickly as they rolled out of the base. Every convoy seemed to carry a death sentence, every mission a gamble with fate. Losses were mounting: hundreds of trucks, thousands of tons of supplies, and countless lives hanging by a thread. In the middle of it all was a man named Tom Harris. A trucker who had spent years hauling cargo long before the war had reached Europe's heart. On the surface, he looked ordinary: calloused hands, a worn leather jacket, and a face hardened by miles on the road. But tonight, the pressure pressed down like the weight of 1,000 tons. Commanders barked orders, their frustration sharp and cold. Soldiers were running low on rations and ammunition, their eyes hollow, morale evaporating faster than the morning mist. Every convoy that failed felt like another nail in the coffin of their hopes. Tom's convoy rolled forward, headlights cutting through the darkness, tires swallowing the mud. Each truck a fragile thread holding the army together. And yet, something inside him stirred a thought, a flicker of audacity, an idea that might seem ridiculous. He could almost hear the whispers of doubt echoing around him, the sneers of fellow drivers who would call it crazy, impossible, foolish. Could one man's ridiculous idea turn the tide? Could it be the spark that saves not just a convoy, but countless lives and the very momentum of the war? Tonight the roads were dark, the enemy was relentless, and hope felt fragile. But in the mind of one trucker, a plan was taking shape, one that could change everything. The morning fog clung to the forested edges of the road like a shroud, muffling the rumble of diesel engines as convoys crawled forward. The standard procedure was simple on paper. Trucks move in tight formations, spaced just enough to keep a steady line, but close enough to maintain command and control. In practice, it was a death trap. Enemy fighters often lay in wait, diving from the clouds to strike the first signs of movement. Mines, hidden under deceptively normal stretches of earth, could turn a single truck into a fiery tomb. Sabotage was constant: rails cut, bridges weakened, supply depots raided. It was no exaggeration to say that the majority of these convoys would never see their destination intact. Historical records whispered the grim truth. Supply losses could reach up to 40% on some routes. A staggering blow when every ton of fuel, every crate of ammunition could tip the balance of a battle. Soldiers on the front lines went hungry, medical units ran out of critical supplies, and morale eroded faster than the roads under relentless bombardment. Inside his cab, Tom gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. The familiar leather was rough against his palms, but comfort had long since fled these roads. He glanced at the men in the truck behind him, faces pale, eyes darting nervously at every shadow. There was a quiet understanding among the drivers, a bond forged in fear and endurance. Each mile carried the weight of comrades relying on them. Each stop a reminder of how easily everything could collapse. "I can't keep watching this," Tom muttered under his breath, voice barely audible over the engine. "There's got to be a better way." He had seen it too many times. A sudden explosion, trucks riddled with bullets, cargo strewn across the road, men scrambling to survive. The conventional methods, tight formations, rigid schedules, predictable routes, were a map to destruction. Yet every convoy had to follow them, because nobody had dared challenge the system. Not yet. In quiet moments between towns, when the convoy slowed and the tension hung like smoke in the cab, Tom would stare at the road ahead. He imagined what it would take to outsmart the enemy, to turn their predictability into a liability. The thought of changing tactics seemed dangerous, almost insane, but the growing toll of failure left him with no choice. Each mission felt like a countdown to disaster, a race against the inevitable, and yet, amidst the fear and frustration, a stubborn spark of determination flickered. If there was a way to protect the men, to save the supplies, to finally turn the tide on these deadly convoys, Tom had to find it. Even if everyone else thought it impossible, even if they called it ridiculous, because on these roads, ordinary methods weren't just failing, They were killing. The smell of diesel and mud clung to Tom's jacket as he stepped out of the cab. The early morning mist curling around the trucks like ghostly tendrils. The convoy yard was quiet, save for the distant clatter of mechanics tuning engines and the low murmur of men discussing the day's route. But Tom's mind wasn't on maintenance schedules or tire pressures. It was on the road ahead, the same roads that had swallowed countless supplies. The same paths that had become death traps for every convoy that dared to follow the old rules. He leaned against the cab, rubbing his temples, eyes narrowing at the rows of trucks lined up in the standard formation. It was predictable, rigid, and safe in theory. But theory didn't stop shells from tearing through the columns, didn't prevent mines from blowing trucks apart, didn't protect the men counting on him. Tom had driven these routes hundreds of times, and he knew every predictable move made them vulnerable. The question gnawed at him like a relentless engine. What if there was another way? For days, he had scribbled notes on scraps of paper, sketching out routes, timing intervals, and unconventional formations. He imagined staggered departures, convoys breaking into smaller, irregular groups that could slip through enemy patrols unnoticed. He considered camouflage techniques, covering trucks with tarps painted to match the terrain, using decoy vehicles to mislead reconnaissance planes. Every idea felt risky, almost absurd. But so was watching another convoy blown apart. So was seeing men die because someone refused to think differently. The next morning, Tom called a meeting in the yard. He gathered his fellow truckers, a motley crew of hardened drivers, all of them weary and fatigued. When he explained his plan, the skepticism was immediate. Staggered convoys? Camouflage? What are you, trying to play hide-and-seek with the Luftwaffe? One of the older drivers scoffed, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. You're talking about throwing all the rules out the window. Even the officers weren't kinder. Lieutenant Harris, a hard-nosed logistics commander known for his strict adherence to protocol, leaned over the map, shaking his head. Tom, this is ridiculous. Convoys are scheduled the way they are for a reason. Chaos is chaos, not strategy. If this fails, you're risking more than trucks. You're risking lives? Tom's jaw tightened. He knew the danger. He had lived it. Every time a convoy went missing, every time a truck was torched, the losses piled up. But he also knew that continuing the same methods guaranteed the same disastrous results. The old system had failed repeatedly. The question wasn't whether his plan was risky, it was whether the old method had already proven far deadlier. I know it's unconventional, he said, his voice low but steady, but we can't keep losing men and supplies because we're afraid to try something different. We have to change how we move. The room was silent, tension hanging thick like the smoke of a distant battlefield. Some men exchanged uneasy glances. Others muttered under their breath. Tom could feel the weight of their doubt pressing on him, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation. Not tonight. Not with lives on the line. Over the next few days, Tom began testing small elements of his plan. He experimented with departure times, sending trucks off in irregular intervals rather than the usual synchronized roll. He tried splitting convoys into smaller groups, letting each move at its own pace, weaving through the forested roads rather than sticking to the main routes. He even covered the vehicles with crude camouflage branches, nets, and painted tarps to make them harder to spot from the air. The results were subtle at first. A truck that would normally have been hit by a stray shell slipped past the enemy undetected. A smaller group avoided a mine section of road entirely, reaching the base hours ahead of schedule. Every tiny success bolstered Tom's confidence, though it did little to change the opinions of his peers. You're playing with fire. Harris, one driver said, slamming his fist into the cab. If the enemy figures this out, they'll tear us apart? I know the risks, Tom admitted. But what choice do we have? Keep driving the same roads in the same formation and pray we survive? Emotion weighed heavily on him. This wasn't just about efficiency or strategy. It was about men's lives, soldiers depending on these supplies to survive. One misstep could mean disaster not just for the convoy, but for the front lines counting on food, ammunition, and medical supplies. He carried that burden with every mile, every decision, Every adjustment, yet amidst the doubt, a quiet determination began to take root. The men who had once laughed at him were starting to notice small improvements. Fewer breakdowns, more trucks reaching their destinations intact, and, most importantly, a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Tom's nights were restless. He pored over maps and notes, imagining every possible scenario: enemy ambush, mines, reconnaissance flights. He calculated intervals, formations, and routes with obsessive precision, sometimes muttering figures to himself in the dark until sleep was little more than a hazy blur. And always, at the edge of his mind, the same question: could this plan work in the face of real combat, against an enemy who thrived on predictability? The ridicule of peers, the doubt of superiors, and the sheer audacity of the idea created a tension that made each day feel like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. And yet, Tom could feel something shifting, a faint glimmer that this so-called ridiculous approach might just be the solution the Allies desperately needed. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. A convoy would depart at dawn, using Tom's full method: staggered departures, irregular formations, and camouflage on every vehicle. The men were tense, some openly skeptical, but there was no turning back. Supplies had to get through. Lives depended on it. As the first truck rumbled forward into the morning fog, Tom's heart pounded. Every mile was a gamble, every moment a test of nerves and skill. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and failure wasn't just an option, it was unthinkable. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Tom Harris knew that if this worked, if his method succeeded, it wouldn't just save a convoy. It could change the way the war was fought, one truck, 1 mile at a time. The road ahead was uncertain. The enemy was relentless, and the world might call it ridiculous. But in that quiet morning, amidst the fog, the engines, and the endless weight of responsibility, a revolution on wheels had begun. The first light of dawn broke over the misty horizon, casting pale streaks across the convoy yard. Engines rumbled softly, a low, uneasy growl as the drivers climbed into their trucks. Today was no ordinary run. Today, Tom's so-called ridiculous method would be tested against the reality of war. Every man felt it, a mixture of anticipation, dread, and cautious hope. As the convoy prepared to roll, Tom walked along the line of vehicles, checking straps, inspecting camouflage nets, and offering terse words of encouragement. He met the eyes of each driver, searching for any sign of fear. Most were pale, some shaking, but a few offered faint nods, a silent agreement that if anyone could make this work, it was him. The first group of trucks rolled out, leaving the yard in staggered intervals, each engine's rumble swallowed by the morning fog. Unlike the rigid formations of old, this convoy was unpredictable. A serpentine line winding through trees and over-rutted roads, its irregular pace designed to confuse enemy scouts. Tom followed closely in his own cab, hands tight on the wheel, eyes scanning the mist for any sign of trouble. It didn't take long. A distant burst of gunfire shattered the fragile silence. Enemy fighters had spotted the first vehicles strafing the road ahead. Drivers ducked instinctively, tires skidding over mud, hearts hammering. Tom's mind raced. Stick to the plan, keep moving, don't panic. The staggered formation, the irregular pace, the camouflage, they were all designed for this. One truck swung wide, narrowly avoiding a hidden mine. The explosion ripped through the forest behind it, sending a plume of dirt and smoke into the sky. The men froze for a heartbeat, hearts in their throats, before shaking themselves free and pressing on. Each driver adapted, improvising instinctively, learning to work with the new method instead of against it. Tom's voice came over the radio, calm but urgent. Keep moving. Stay staggered. Don't bunch up. Eyes on the road. The convoy pressed on, winding through narrow forest paths, small streams, and abandoned villages. Enemy patrols fired from the tree line, but the staggered timing and unpredictable paths kept casualties lower than anyone dared hope. A truck that would normally have been hit by machine gun fire slipped through the gaps, reaching cover safely. Another avoided a barricade entirely, thanks to a last-minute detour Tom had scouted days earlier. Still, the tension was relentless. Every shadow, every sudden movement in the fog felt like a threat. A low-hanging branch tore across the windshield of one truck, momentarily blinding the driver. Tom's hands gripped the wheel as he swerved to avoid a ditch, his heart pounding. But the convoy held together, adapting to each challenge, learning as they moved. By midday, a subtle shift had taken hold. The initial terror of trying something new was giving way to cautious confidence. Drivers began to anticipate the next obstacle, communicating over radios with a growing sense of coordination. The ridiculous plan was proving its worth. One by one, trucks arrived at the checkpoint, battered but intact. Supplies mostly unharmed. Tom took a deep breath, letting himself feel a glimmer of relief. The convoy had made it further than any before using the old, predictable method. The staggered formation, the camouflage, the irregular timing, they had worked. And yet he knew the enemy was relentless. Today's success didn't guarantee tomorrow. Still, for the first time, the men began to believe. Even those who had mocked him now nodded in quiet respect, seeing with their own eyes that a new way was possible. Tom's jaw ached from tension, muscles stiff from gripping the wheel, but a spark of pride warmed him. They were learning. They were surviving. The final stretch of the route brought the convoy into an open plain where the enemy had often laid ambushes. Tom's heart raced. This was the most dangerous section, the moment where success or disaster would be impossible to ignore. He took a deep breath, keeping his eyes sharp, scanning for movement, listening for the faintest sound of approaching engines or gunfire. Sudden shadow fell across the lead truck, a reconnaissance plane dipping low, spotting the convoy. For a tense moment, it seemed like disaster was inevitable. But then the staggered formation came into play. The plane's observers couldn't target the trucks effectively, losing track as they twisted through the trees and across dirt roads. Bullets rained down in brief bursts, striking the road or ricocheting harmlessly off trees, but no one was hit. The trucks pressed on, faster now, almost running on instinct and adrenaline. By late afternoon, the convoy reached the main supply depot. The drivers climbed down, their faces smeared with dirt and sweat, muscles aching, hearts still racing. And yet there was a sense of triumph, quiet but undeniable. Supplies were delivered. Losses were minimal. The impossible had been made possible. If only for this single test. Tom climbed down from his cab, letting out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at his men, tired, scared, exhilarated, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. A cautious, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. For the first time, it felt like the tide might be turning. He knew there would be more tests, more danger, more ambush. The enemy would adapt, find new ways to strike. But today, the first real proof of his method existed. It worked. Against all odds, the convoy had survived. And the ridiculous idea had begun to earn its place in history. As night fell, Tom stared at the road they had traveled, the scars of battle etched into the earth and the trucks alike. The fog rolled in again, heavier this time, carrying with it the scent of smoke and mud. Somewhere ahead, more convoys would depart, and the enemy would wait. But now, Tom knew they had a real chance to change the way the war was fought. 1 mile at a time, and as he climbed back into his cab, engine rumbling beneath him, a quiet determination settled over him. The first test had succeeded, but the real challenge was just beginning. Tomorrow the road would call again, and the question remained, could this method continue to save lives under the relentless pressure of war? One thing was certain, the men were watching, the enemy was watching. And history was waiting to see if one trucker's ridiculous idea could truly turn the tide. The sun had barely risen when the convoy approached what everyone knew as the deadliest stretch of road in the region, a narrow pass, flanked by dense forest on both sides. Intelligence reports warned of enemy activity, mines hidden beneath the mud, ambush points along the tree line, and a known concentration of enemy troops in the ravine ahead. For every convoy that had attempted this route before, it had been a nightmare. Many hadn't returned. Tom sat in the cab of his lead truck, hands gripping the wheel, jaw tight, eyes scanning every shadow. Today wasn't just another test. It was the moment where his ridiculous method would prove its worth or fail catastrophically. Behind him, the convoy moved in staggered intervals, each truck carefully following the unpredictable paths Tom had mapped out. Camouflage nets draped over vehicles blended them into the forest floor. Smaller groups twisted and turned along secondary trails, a web of movement that defied the enemy's expectations. The first sign of trouble came suddenly. A burst of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets pinged off metal, tore into trees, and sprayed dirt across the road. Drivers ducked instinctively, some swerving to avoid the hail of fire. But instead of chaos, the convoy moved like a living machine, trucks anticipating one another's moves. Gaps shifting naturally, smaller groups ducking into cover while decoys drew attention elsewhere. A mine exploded beneath one of the decoy trucks, a controlled sacrifice that diverted enemy fire and cleared the path for the main supply vehicles. Tom felt the shockwave under his cab, but his heart didn't falter. This was exactly what the plan had been designed for. The enemy, frustrated by the unexpected patterns and staggered timing, scrambled to respond. Air reconnaissance planes swooped in, attempting to locate the trucks. But they couldn't identify the convoy as a cohesive target. The staggered intervals and irregular formations made the trucks seem like scattered, isolated vehicles rather than a supply line. Every maneuver, every tiny tactical decision Tom had implemented, was now paying off. Drivers shouted over radios, voices strained with adrenaline and focus. "Left flank clear. Move ahead. Gap 3, keep it tight but don't bunch up." Coordination and trust had never been more critical. Men who had doubted Tom's strategy were now moving in unison, acting almost instinctively, guided by a method that had once seemed impossible. For hours, the convoy threaded through the gauntlet. Enemy fire continued sporadically, a constant reminder of the stakes, but each ambush was neutralized or avoided through a combination of surprise tactics, quick thinking, and sheer determination. The trucks that would have fallen in previous attempts made it through untouched. The supplies intact. By late afternoon, the last of the vehicles crested the final hill and rolled into the supply depot. There was no explosion, no destruction, no loss. Every crate of ammunition, every ration, every critical piece of equipment had made it through the deadly stretch. Commanders who had once doubted stood in stunned silence as Tom and his convoy climbed down from their cabs. Mud-smeared and exhausted, yet triumphant, one officer finally spoke, his voice thick with disbelief. We lost only a handful of vehicles. 90% of our supplies made it through? How is this possible?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He let the moment sink in, watching the men gather their courage, pride evident in their weary faces. Morale, which had been fractured and fragile, surged like a tide. Soldiers who had feared another empty supply line now cheered as crates of food and ammunition were unloaded. Lives would be saved, battles sustained, all because one trucker had dared to think differently. The significance of what had just occurred wasn't lost on anyone. The ridiculous method, staggered departures, irregular formations, camouflage. Detroit trucks had fundamentally changed the way supplies could move across dangerous territory. Where previously supply losses had hovered around 40 to 50%, today's success represented a staggering reduction of nearly 90%. Tom allowed himself a brief smile. The risk, the ridicule, the sleepless nights spent calculating every possible obstacle, they had all been worth it. This was more than a personal victory. It was a turning point for the war effort. A demonstration that ingenuity and courage could triumph where convention had failed. As the convoy was checked over and supplies unloaded, Tom looked out over the forested road that had once been a graveyard for trucks and drivers alike. He imagined the enemy trying to predict his next moves, knowing that the unpredictability of his methods had forever altered the game. And though tomorrow would bring new challenges, new ambushes, and new threats, one undeniable truth remained. The tide had turned, for the men who had once laughed at him, for the commanders who had doubted, for the soldiers who depended on every crate delivered. Tom Harris had proven that a single, bold idea could change everything. The road ahead was still dangerous, but it was now navigable. And for the first time in a long while, hope wasn't just a fragile notion. It was real, tangible, and powerful. The convoy rested that evening. Engines silent, the forest quiet except for the distant calls of birds and the occasional creak of settling trucks. But even in that stillness, the legacy of the day was clear. A new strategy had been born. One that would save countless lives and secure supply lines that once seemed doomed to failure. And as Tom watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, he knew that this moment, the first full triumph of his ridiculous plan, was only the beginning. The war had tested him, challenged him, mocked him. But now, against all odds, Tom had turned the tide. The forest had quieted. The danger of the morning replaced by a tentative calm. Trucks, once battered and mud-streaked, sat in neat rows at the depot, their cargo safely delivered. For the men of the convoy, the adrenaline was slowly ebbing, replaced by exhaustion and an unfamiliar sense of pride. Tom Harris stepped down from his cab, shoulders stiff, but his chest felt lighter than it had in months. The gamble had paid off. Word of the convoy's success spread quickly through the command posts. Officers who had once questioned his judgment were now eager to understand the details. Lieutenant Harris, the same man who had called Tom's plan ridiculous, approached him with a mix of astonishment and respect. "Tom," he said, his voice low but steady, "what you did today, it's extraordinary. Supplies that should have been lost every truck made it through. I don't know how to thank you." Tom shook his head, still catching his breath. "I didn't do it alone. The men adapted, followed the plan, and made it work. I just thought differently." The truth was, though, that thinking differently had been the hardest part. Convincing others, facing ridicule, and risking lives on a method no one else believed in it had taken everything he had. And now, seeing the results, the weight of those days pressed against him like a tide of relief. The convoy hadn't just survived, they had thrived under impossible odds. In the following weeks, Tom's method was put to the test again. Multiple convoys adopted the staggered departure times, irregular formations, and camouflage techniques he had pioneered. Each run delivered supplies with startling efficiency, losses dropping dramatically. Where once convoys were decimated by ambush or mines, now trucks slipped through dangerous roads with far greater success. The military recognized the strategy not as a gamble, but as a vital innovation across the supply lines. Men who had once doubted Tom's judgment began to see him in a new light. Drivers who had mocked the ridiculous idea now sought his advice, listening intently as he explained the nuances of timing, spacing, and evasive maneuvering. Camaraderie grew stronger, built not just on shared danger, but on shared achievement. Morale, which had been fragile and fractured, began to recover. Soldiers received their rations, medical units restocked supplies, and the front lines steadied under the newfound reliability of supply chains. One afternoon, as Tom oversaw another convoy's departure, a young driver approached him, eyes wide with respect. "Sir, I never thought we'd make it through those last ambush alive. Your plan saved us all." Tom placed a hand on the man's shoulder, feeling the weight of responsibility lift slightly. "We all saved each other. Never forget that. Every decision, every mile, every truck mattered." Even beyond the convoys, the impact was felt. Commanders began to document the strategy, analyzing its effectiveness and incorporating it into training manuals. New drivers were briefed on the principles Tom had developed: unpredictability, staggered movements, and deception. What had once seemed foolish now became standard practice, a testament to the power of innovation under pressure. Despite the recognition, Tom remained humble. The accolades and thanks were welcome, but the real reward was in seeing lives protected, supplies delivered, and hope restored to soldiers who had known too much loss. He knew that one convoy, one run, one idea could ripple outward, influencing outcomes far beyond what any single man could achieve. One evening, after a long day of planning and overseeing departures, Tom stood on a hill overlooking the road that had once claimed so many lives. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the convoy as trucks rolled steadily toward their destinations. He could see the men chatting quietly, laughing softly, a sound that had been absent for far too long. Lieutenant Harris joined him, a rare smile on his face. You've done more than save a convoy, Tom. You've changed how we fight this war. Your method. It's going to save countless lives. Tom nodded, staring down the road. I just did what I thought had to be done. But seeing it work, it's more than I could have imagined. In the quiet of that evening, as trucks disappeared into the distance, Tom felt a profound sense of closure. The ridicule, the doubts, the sleepless nights, they had all led to this moment. The method that had once seemed absurd had proven itself, protecting men, equipment, and the fragile thread of hope that tied together the front lines. For the first time in months, Tom allowed himself to relax. He had faced ridicule, risked everything, and emerged with not just success, but recognition and respect. More importantly, he had made a difference. Every crate delivered, every soldier fed, every mission completed without loss was a reminder that courage and ingenuity could prevail, even in the darkest moments of war. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, Tom Harris knew that history would remember this day not because of any single act of bravery, but because one man had dared to think differently. The ridiculous convoy method had become a lifeline, a beacon of hope, and a symbol of what determination and innovation could achieve. And for the truckers who had once laughed, for the commanders who had doubted, and for the soldiers who now counted on their supplies, Tom had earned something far greater than recognition. He had earned trust, respect, and the knowledge that even in war, one idea could change everything. The roads that had once been death traps now stretched quietly through forests and fields, scars of battle fading beneath the morning sun. Trucks moved steadily along routes that had claimed so many lives before, each mile a testament to a single man's vision. Tom Harris stood at the edge of a supply depot, watching engines hum steadily and drivers move with purpose. He could feel the weight of history settling around him, not in monuments or medals, but in the roads that no longer spelled certain death for those who drove them. It was hard to believe how far they had come. Just months earlier, supply convoys had been a source of dread, a chain of losses that seemed impossible to break. Trucks had been destroyed, crates of rations scattered to the wind, and morale had plummeted with every mission gone wrong. Officers barked orders, men feared for their lives, and the war's machinery seemed indifferent to human suffering. And yet, in that darkness, one man had dared to imagine something different. Tom had stared at the predictable patterns, the rigid formations, and the relentless losses, and he had asked the impossible question, what if we tried another way? The answer had seemed absurd at first. Staggered departures, irregular formations, camouflage, and decoys, ideas dismissed by peers, ridiculed by superiors. It was dangerous, unorthodox, even borderline insane. But the stakes were higher than ridicule. Lives were at risk. Supplies were essential. The war itself depended on these convoys reaching their destinations. History often remembers generals and battles, strategies and victories, but sometimes it is the quiet ingenuity of a single individual that changes everything. Tom's ridiculous idea did more than reduce supply losses. It preserved hope. It saved soldiers from hunger, ensured that medics had the tools they needed, and kept the lines of communication and command alive. Every crate delivered, every convoy completed, was a small revolution on wheels. As the weeks passed, the method spread. Convoys across Europe adopted the staggered formations, irregular schedules, and camouflage strategies Tom had pioneered. Officers documented and trained drivers in the new approach, turning what had once been a daring experiment into standard practice. Mortality rates for supply missions plummeted and morale surged. The difference was not just in numbers, it was in the hearts of men, who no longer faced each journey with the same helpless fear. Tom often reflected quietly on the absurdity of it all. How close had they come to dismissing the idea outright? How many more lives could have been lost if fear and skepticism had prevailed? And yet, in the end, courage, creativity, and the willingness to challenge convention had prevailed. One trucker's vision had become a lifeline for thousands. He thought of the men who had once mocked him, now standing with newfound respect. He thought of the officers who had doubted him, now implementing his strategy across the front. and he thought of the soldiers on the front lines, unaware of the ingenuity behind the steady flow of supplies that allowed them to fight another day. Their survival was the quietest, most profound acknowledgment of all. The road ahead would always be dangerous. War is relentless, unpredictable, and unforgiving. But the lessons of that convoy, the courage to question, the willingness to innovate, and the perseverance to see an idea through against all odds would endure far beyond any single battle. Sometimes, the most ridiculous ideas are the ones that save the day. Sometimes, change does not come from orders shouted in a command post, but from the quiet conviction of someone willing to take a risk when everyone else clings to the familiar. And sometimes, history is shaped not only by generals and strategies, but by the ingenuity of a trucker willing to think differently. Tom Harris would never have claimed heroism. He never sought recognition or fame. But the legacy of his idea would live on in every safe convoy, in every ton of supplies delivered, and in every life preserved. In the quiet hum of engines along once deadly roads, the echoes of his courage could be felt, proof that ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to embrace the ridiculous can change the course of history. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, Tom watched the convoy roll forward. He felt a deep, unspoken pride, a sense of fulfillment that could not be measured in accolades, medals, or reports. He had done something meaningful. He had made a difference. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. History would remember the battles, the generals, and the victories. But those who understood the war's lifeblood, the supplies that sustained it, would remember the trucker who dared to be ridiculous. And through his courage, thousands had survived, and the war itself had been changed, one convoy at a time.